The Battle of the Atlantic is predicated on a simple geographical reality. Britain, Great Britain, the island of Great Britain, which includes England, Scotland, and Wales, has about as much land as the state of Idaho. But whereas Idaho has about 1.5 million people, Britain has about 50 million people. If you were to take every inch, square inch of arable land in the British Isles and devote it to farming in the most efficient way possible, known in the 1940s, the people of Britain would starve. There would be mega death, and Britain could not continue the war because starving people can't produce guns, planes, and tanks. This was known in World War I as the Germans tried to blockade Britain by submarine, as Britain was blockading Germany by surface ship. When Hitler comes to power, he has the same mania for battleships that most people had in the early 20th century. So as he decides to violate the Washington Naval Treaty, which Germany never really signed, and to manipulate the British into a series of one-sided naval agreements that give Germany the opportunity to build a new high seas fleet, Hitler focuses on building a surface navy of pocket battleships, cruisers, and battleships. He only incidentally allows Admiral Dönitz and others to begin building a small number of U-boats, Unterseeboots, diesel-electric submersible warships armed with a deck gun or two and armed with torpedoes. Now, the Type 7 was a highly maneuverable U-boat used in the waters near to Europe, shorter range. The Type 9 was used on longer cruises to the South Atlantic and out into the wider seas of the world. German doctrine early in the war was not to repeat the attack on civilian shippings that characterized the height of World War I, but rather to focus on warships. But despite the orders from the German Admiralty, on the opening night of the war, a German submarine, a German U-boat, sank the British liner Athenia with great loss of civilian life. Hitler was embarrassed, and he ordered the U-boat campaign to focus on warships rather than on merchant vessels. And this was the case up to the end of the Phony War and the conquest of France. At that point, Britain made clear in Churchillian oratory that it was not going to surrender. And at this point, Hitler unleashed his U-boats in the first so-called happy time of the U-boats. The British immediately started the war with convoys, something they had resisted in World War I. A convoy is where you gather your merchant ships into a giant flock, like a bunch of sheep, and you then guard that flock as it moves across the ocean with a series of sheepdogs, in this case destroyers, frigates, and corvettes. Fairly small warships that can keep pace or outpace German submarines, and they can outfight them either at even odds or with the superior odds that the convoy can bring to bear. The idea is you put all your eggs in one basket, and then you watch that basket very carefully. So, the British convoy, and the British have a new type of device called ASDIC. We call it sonar. Effectively, what it does is with sound waves, similar to what radar does with radio waves. You send out from an aquatic microphone a sound pulse. Boom! And that sound pulse goes out until it hits something solid. Boop! And that recoil, that bounce back sound, boop, is picked up by a receiver, an aquatic receiver, and that receiver, by telling the distance and how long it took from the ping to go out, boop, 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 when it's boop, 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 I could do that all day. It's just fun. What you can do is you can use math, the magic of math, just ask Mr. Gabrielson, to calculate the distance of the object that's giving you a return bounce back. if it's moving or not relative to you, if it's moving relative to its own position, what its distance is, what its speed is, what its course is, what its size is, depending upon how sophisticated your gear is. At the very least, you should be able to tell if there's something big and solid near you. Could be a whale, could be a submarine, could be a ship. Combined with radar, ASDIC is going to make hunting submarines much easier. But the Battle of the Atlantic is going to be this race, this technological back and forth between both sides. So the Germans have submarines, the British used convoys, the British used ASDIC, which is designed to find submerged submarines. And submerged submarines tend to be slower than submarines on the surface. So Admiral Karl Dönitz, the head of the U-boat arm of the Kriegsmarine, the German war fleet, institutes a new type of tactic called the wolf pack. Wolf packs do not involve lone submarines firing torpedoes from underwater. Instead, Dönitz understands that the convoys that are going to supply Britain come from Canada and the United States. And these convoys are organized in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and they're organized in New York Harbor and along the eastern seaboard of the United States. And that these convoys are basically going to move east by northeast across the Atlantic Ocean to the British Isles. Dönitz also understands that the air search capabilities of Britain and British Canada leave a large gap in the central Atlantic. So that's where he's going to deploy his wolf packs. Wolf pack tactics are to have some scouting submarines detect an approaching convoy. When they do, once per day, all the German submarines contact home by radio and receive orders by radio. And they use a highly encrypted code called Enigma. Well, when they spot a convoy and they mark its course and speed, the wolf pack is organized to lie in wait in the path of the convoy and to intercept it after the sun sets. At night, the wolf pack surfaces, comes in on the surface. These are small targets on the surface. They're very hard to see with the Mark I eyeball, and they're very hard to catch with radar, especially radar early in the war. What the wolf packs will do is allow the convoy to come in on them, and then they'll fire their torpedoes and submerge, and sometimes they'll actually resurface inside the various concentric circles of protection of the convoy to shoot particular ships. The best targets were ammunition ships and oilers. Oilers because they carry flammable oil, and ammunition ships because anytime you can make it's a good thing from the standpoint of a U-boat submariner. So the wolf packs are a real problem, and the British start losing massive numbers of ships. But they get some help. At this point, the United States is still neutral in the war, but President Roosevelt moves a maritime protection zone off the eastern seaboard of the United States right into the center of the Atlantic. And so the U.S. Navy is now escorting convoys to Britain all the way up to the area south of the eastern Greenland coast. This is co-belligerency, but the American people do not know about it. And in fact, in late 1941, from July and August of 41 on, there is an undeclared naval war between the American Navy and the German Kriegsmarine. The USS Reuben James it's an American four-stacker destroyer, is sunk along with another destroyer in this battle. And the families are not told why they were killed in an accident. They were killed in maneuvers at sea. The ship was sunk due to an accident. It was not revealed that it was an act of war because the American people were still at peace. They thought that. More than that, by reducing the area Britain had to spend its resources on, the British were able to better fight the U-boats. America also, since Denmark is captured by the Germans, seizes control of Iceland, which is controlled by the Danes. And with American convoys American naval warships escorting convoys to Iceland or as far as Icelandic waters, the British can really focus on the area around their islands. But there is still a problem with airplanes. Aircraft are the best hunters of submarines around until you end up with nuclear submarines hunting one another. That's a modern thing. And the need for long distance aircraft in all other areas makes it very difficult for the British and the Americans to cover that mid Atlantic gap. When America enters the war, it's a second happy time for the submariners because the eastern seaboard doesn't maintain war discipline very well. American cities stay lit up. American headlights are not dimmed. So the number of ships traveling along the eastern seaboard moving gear and moving supplies are backlit by American cities and light pollution from the eastern coast, and the American fleet is completely unprepared to deal with a full-scale submarine war right in their backyard. Where I used to live near Portland, Maine, saw submarine activity within eyesight of the shore. So the war goes back and forth. We develop escort carriers, small merchant ships with flight decks. At first, the planes take off on a one-way flight and they bomb submarines, and then they drop out by parachute and ditch the plane. And later, these escort carriers are big enough to launch and receive aircraft, light aircraft, able to attack submarines. We also use the B-24 Liberator, which is a long-range maritime bomber, or long-range bomber, to close the mid-Atlantic gap. So we have caught up in the technology race. And by 1943, the threat to convoys reduces. But in 1944, the Germans develop a new kind of U-boat, the Walter boat. The Walter boat has what's called a schnorkel on it, which allows it to put its periscope up. Next to its periscope is a high-powered air tube. And it doesn't have to surface to recharge its batteries and to operate its diesel motors. It can do everything through the schnorkel. With a schnorkel, a submarine is much harder to spot. The Walther boats are also much faster. They use a much different form of diesel-electric power. And luckily for us, there were only a few of these Walther boats built before the end of the war. But every time one side had a technological edge, the other side responded, which caused a back and forth technology race. In the end, the Battle of the Atlantic is the one thing that kept Winston Churchill up at night. He knew that if more tons of shipping were sunk than could be replaced by British and American shipyards, that slowly but surely the British people would starve and Britain would be knocked out of the war. The one thing he was afraid of was losing the Battle of the Atlantic. Otherwise, he was reasonably confident that sooner or later the Allies would win, and as Russia and America both get into the war, that confidence just grows into a near certainty that ultimately, sooner or later, the Allies would win. But it's a close-run thing in the Atlantic. And in 1940-41, in 1942, or into 1943, it is very, very, very close to doomsday for the British. And the British start adapting their food supplies. They cut all of their food with massive amounts of sawdust. It's almost inedible to Americans who get a hold of British rations at various points because they're eating everything from offal to blood mixed with sawdust. It's just what they have to eat is awful. Awful is awful. Anyway, ultimately, with technology, the Battle of the Atlantic is won, but it's the longest battle of World War II, from basically September 3rd, 4th, 1939, up through May 5th, 1945, the entire phase of the European War. And some U-boats continued to ship Nazis and supplies down to Argentina after the war was done. And some U-boats out in the Pacific continued to work with the Japanese, well, up until surrender day.